In today's video, we examine fatal encounters with some of the ocean's most dangerous predators, from a bull shark ambush in Florida's Indian River Lagoon to a deep-water spearfishing tragedy off Montauk Point. But first we begin with the fatal mistake of a woman who touched a great white shark washed up in California. It was October 21st, 2016, and the surf at Pismo Beach rolled heavy and uneven beneath a gray coastal sky. Early rain had passed through during the night, leaving the beach littered with kelp, driftwood, and scattered debris. By mid-morning, the tide was retreating, revealing long stretches of damp sand and low pools that would soon become the stage for another tragic encounter between human compassion and nature's unforgiving reality. Julia Kemp was a 33-year-old veterinary technician from Fresno. Before moving to the coast, she had worked for years at a busy emergency vet clinic in Bakersfield, where she built a reputation for composure under pressure. Outside of work, she lived alone, preferred long hikes to social gatherings. Her colleagues at the coastal bird rescue near Morro Bay knew her as someone who would rush toward danger when animals were involved. Sometimes too eager to help, always too willing to ignore the warnings that kept others alive. She possessed that dangerous combination of genuine animal expertise and misplaced confidence. That week, Julia had driven down to spend the week with her mother, who was recovering from minor surgery in San Luis Obispo. She brought her work phone and a few basic supplies, not intending to get involved in anything serious, but she also couldn't ignore the coastline. That morning, around 9:45 a.m., beachgoers noticed something unusual just south of the main pier, a massive shape in the surf partially buried in wet sand. As the tide receded further, the form became clearer, a great white shark, roughly 12 feet long, listing on its side in the shallows. Its gills twitched weakly, and its tail fin rocked slightly with the waves. A small crowd gathered from a safe distance, some taking videos, others calling for marine rescue. Great white sharks have evolved over 400 million years into apex predators, reaching 20 feet in length with bite forces over 4,000 psi. Even when sluggish or disoriented, they remain fully lethal, capable of tearing through flesh and bone with jaws that can crush a human torso in one bite. Most critically, great whites are ambush predators, capable of explosive bursts of speed and violence, even when they appear motionless or dying. Julia had come for a quiet walk before heading to the pharmacy, but when she saw the crowd, she veered off course and approached the animal. Several people were already speculating that it might be dying or stranded, with someone mentioning calling a marine rescue hotline. But Julia didn't wait for professionals. She stepped directly into the surf. Witnesses later described Julia kneeling beside the massive predator, brushing sand off its flank with one hand while leaning forward to place the other near its gills, possibly checking for signs of life. Several people called out warnings from the safety of dry sand. A woman shouted that it was still alive. A man further back said he saw the eye rotate slightly, tracking movement with the cold calculation of a hunter. But Julia didn't respond to their desperate calls. Her attention was fixed on the animal before her. And then the shark thrashed. It twisted its body in a sharp arc as it swung its massive tail toward shore. The head rose just enough to pivot, jaws snapping outward and upward into Julia's upper chest with the explosive force that makes great whites the ocean's most efficient killers. The impact lifted her briefly off balance, as witnesses described hearing a wet, abrupt sound. Julia screamed once before being pulled forward into the churning surf. The water around her erupted in brown foam. A second bite followed within seconds, the shark clamping down on her right side from mid-torso to pelvis and shaking her with visible force. Julia's body was dragged several feet out from shore, her legs briefly lifting above the waterline. Then the shark released her, likely a reflexive response after the initial bite, and began to drift away with the backflow, its movement still uneven as it disappeared into the deeper trough. The strike had been defensive or startled, not a sustained predatory attack, consistent with rare but catastrophic cases involving stranded great whites. A lifeguard on duty reached Julia within moments of her resurfacing, but it was already too late. She was face down, unresponsive, and missing her right arm entirely. Her upper chest showed deep lacerations and crush injuries, consistent with a major bite force event. Despite immediate CPR and the rapid arrival of paramedics called by bystanders, she was pronounced dead at the scene. California Department of Fish and Wildlife launched an investigation determining that the shark had likely been disoriented rather than stranded, trapped in the inner surf zone while following prey during the low tide window. No tracking tags were found, no follow-up sightings recorded. The predator had simply vanished back into the depths. Julia's funeral was held privately 5 days later, attended by family and members of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where she had volunteered. Her family declined all interview requests. The rescue organization quietly retired her field identification. In the weeks that followed, Pismo Beach officials installed new signage along the surf zone, warning visitors to stay back from stranded or injured marine animals. The messaging emphasized that even disoriented wildlife could pose serious danger to would-be rescuers. If the stillness of a stranded shark could mask a fatal mistake in California, then in the humid shallows of Florida's Indian River Lagoon, it was murky water that hid something far worse. It was July 4th, 2015, and heat shimmered over the Indian River Lagoon by late morning as another tragedy began to unfold in Florida's deceptively peaceful waters. Mangrove roots cast webbed shadows across the tide-soaked mud, and the stillness between gusts of wind made the water look flat and harmless. But beneath the surface, ancient predators moved with deadly purpose through the murky depths. Darren Willett, a 41-year-old construction worker from Melbourne, Florida, had spent most of his life along these waters. He fished, shrimped, and crabbed from the causeways as a kid, and his comfort in brackish environments bordered on the reckless. To friends, he was easygoing, funny, and prone to brushing off warnings. He joked often about Florida wildlife, boasting that sharks only bite if you taste like trouble. What Darren failed to understand was the apex predator that ruled these waters. Bull sharks represent one of nature's most perfectly adapted killers, capable of thriving in both saltwater and freshwater environments. These stocky predators can grow up to 11 feet long and weigh over 500 pounds, with bite forces exceeding 1,300 pounds per square inch. Unlike great whites that prefer open ocean hunting, bull sharks are ambush predators that lurk in shallow, murky waters where visibility is limited and escape is nearly impossible. Their aggressive nature and territorial behavior make them responsible for more attacks on humans than any other shark species, except great whites. That morning, Darren and two co-workers took kayaks from the launch near Palm Bay and paddled inland through one of the canal-fed channels, completely unaware of the danger lurking beneath them. Darren knew these waters well, but familiarity bred complacency. He'd seen bait fish scatter before and assumed it was just jacks or snook, not a bull shark. By midday, they found a quiet spot inside a thicket of red mangroves where they anchored, cracked drinks, and stood in the warm shallows, letting the water reach their thighs. Local fish and wildlife officials had posted brief advisories earlier that week about multiple bull shark sightings along canal edges, with reports of baitfish schools being chased into tight corners. The Indian River Lagoon's shallow, warm, brackish waters create the perfect nursery environment for young bull sharks, while mature adults enter these same waters to hunt mullet, sheep's head, and smaller sharks. These predators tolerate freshwater and salt equally, making them common in Florida's inland waterways, where unsuspecting humans venture for recreation. Additionally, bull sharks are highly adaptable predators, thriving in both saltwater and freshwater. Reaching 11 feet and over 500 pounds, they strike with 1,300 psi bite force and often ambush prey in shallow, murky waters. Their aggression and territorial behavior have made them one of the top shark species involved in attacks on humans. Around 1:15 p.m., Darren waded a few steps farther out into the murky water to cool down. One of his co-workers, Eddie, later recalled glancing down to open another drink when he heard Darren's terrified scream pierce the afternoon air. The surface exploded around Darren's legs in a violent eruption of white water, thrashing limbs and blood. The bull shark had struck from below with the explosive force that makes these predators so deadly in shallow water encounters. Darren screamed in panic as his arms flailed, then reached downward as he stumbled, one foot sinking deeper into the silty bottom. Eddie ran toward his friend, but stopped short as the second strike came almost immediately. Another burst of motion and a splash of red that turned the water dense and opaque. This time, the shark's massive head broke the surface briefly. Jaws latched onto Darren's inner thigh in a grip designed by millions of years of evolution to crush bone and tear flesh. The predator shook once with devastating efficiency, then released its dying prey and vanished back into the murky depths. Darren fell sideways into the water that was rapidly turning dark with his blood. He floated briefly, then went still. Neither of his companions dared enter the crimson water, knowing instinctively that the predator might still be lurking nearby. They shouted his name desperately and tried to call emergency services, but there was no signal in the remote cove. By the time they reached the main channel and flagged a passing boat, it had been over 10 minutes since Darren had disappeared beneath the surface. Search crews arrived by evening, county marine units, dive teams, and Florida fish and wildlife officers, but it was already too late for rescue, only recovery. At low tide the next morning, Darren's body was found on the shore less than 60 yards from the attack site. His right leg was gone below the knee, torn away by the shark's powerful jaws. The thigh wounds showed the clean edges and deep tearing consistent with a large bull shark bite, with officials estimating the attacker to be a mature specimen between 7 and 9 feet long. The coroner listed exsanguination as the cause of death. Darren had bled out in minutes from the severed femoral artery. No defensive injuries were recorded on his arms or hands, indicating the attack had been too swift and overwhelming for any meaningful resistance. Darren's funeral was held quietly in Melbourne, attended by family, co-workers, and local fishermen who had known him since childhood. The only formal obituary ran in a regional newsletter. Florida Fish and Wildlife issued a low-profile safety reminder the following week, warning residents not to stand or swim in murky, brackish water near fish activity, especially during summer months. The bulletin received little attention, and no beach closures were implemented since the lagoon is not classified for recreational swimming in most interior reaches. A murky lagoon could swallow a man feet from his friends, while on a bright Hawaiian morning, a drifting boogie board would pull a cautious surfer into the path of something even larger. It was May 29, 2017, Memorial Day morning, and the tide at Maili Beach on Oahu's west coast was running just past mid. Early swimmers waded into the shallows, but children's screams echoed over broken waves. Shari Tuamotu, a 28-year-old part-time surfer and lifelong ocean-goer, stood barefoot in the wet sand, watching a foam-topped boogie board drift past the first set. Her younger cousin, barely 10, called out uncertainly whether to follow or wait. Shari told her to stay, then walked into the water. She had just finished a morning shift at a local diner in Nanakuli, still wearing an old bikini under her uniform shorts. Cautious by nature, Shari had grown up casting nets and cleaning reef fish. Her father had taught her the warning signs: turtles diving too fast, fish schooling too tight, shadows that didn't move like waves. She knew the reef edge like the ridgelines behind their house and rarely paddled out far or surfed in cloudy water. But the water that morning didn't seem dangerous, just murky, and the board wasn't far. However, several fishermen had noted a large tiger patrolling the reef edge earlier that week, about 150 yards offshore. A local diver claimed to have seen it again the evening before, but sightings in Maili weren't unusual, and no new warnings had been posted. The water that morning had reduced clarity due to wind, and the southern tower sat unmanned while staff responded to a minor injury farther up the beach. For a brief window, no one was watching the surf directly. Tiger sharks are among Hawaii's top predators, often over 12 feet long and 1,400 pounds. Unlike fast-striking great whites, they patrol near-shore waters with slow, deliberate movements, especially at dawn and dusk. Their serrated teeth and powerful jaws can cut through flesh, bone, and even turtle shells with ease. Shari was waist-deep by the time she reached the drifting board. Her cousin watched anxiously from shore as one witness, a man setting up shade with his family, later described a dark shape just appearing behind her. Another woman waiting nearby said she felt something shift in the current, like the water lifting unevenly, a subtle sign that massive predatory movement was occurring beneath the surface. Then, out of nowhere, the tiger shark struck, attacking from below. Witnesses described Shari dropping the board and twisting, trying to backpedal as a surge of water lifted her from the side. A massive dorsal fin breached briefly as the shark's jaws clamped down on her torso and shoulder. Her body jolted sideways as blood burst across the surface. The shark began to twist violently, a death roll used to tear flesh from prey too large to swallow whole. Tiger sharks have a bite force over 1,000 psi, strong enough to fracture bone and sever limbs. Their serrated teeth saw through tissue, leaving wounds that bleed heavily and resist clotting. Her cousin screamed as two men ran into the water without thinking. One grabbed a flotation ring from a nearby cooler, but by the time they reached her, the water had gone thick with blood, and she was no longer upright. The shark released briefly, then circled once with predatory curiosity, bumping her legs before gliding away into deeper blue. The entire attack lasted less than 15 seconds, and final. Sherry's was unresponsive when pulled from the water. The two men immediately called for help, and it took over 20 minutes to arrive. They attempted CPR, but it was too late. Her time of death was recorded as 9:26 a.m. Based on bite pattern and the removal of flesh from a wide arc, Division of Aquatic Resources biologists confirmed it was likely a mature tiger shark over 10 feet long, possibly female. The shark had exhibited normal territorial feeding behavior and would not be targeted or removed. Sherry's family held a ceremony 2 days later as relatives and neighbors gathered on the beach at dusk, bringing food, flowers, and reef stones. Chants were recited while plumeria and tea leaves were scattered in the surf. One local station aired a respectful segment without footage. At her workplace, a laminated note was taped to the break room fridge expressing how much her calm and kind presence would be missed. After the surf settled and flowers washed back to shore in Maili, a flat stretch of open water near the Exumakais pulled a lone snorkeler into the silent path of a circling white tip. It was August 3rd, 2013, and the Exuma Sound stretched flat and windless under a pale sky. The water below the anchored dive vessel was sapphire blue, fading to black with depth as over 2,000 feet of water lay beneath the hull, part of the vast trench separating the Exumakais from the open Atlantic. The sea felt empty, but nothing in these depths was ever truly still. Michael Sutter, a 35-year-old certified open water diver from Michigan, leaned over the stern rail, adjusting his mask. He had just finished a morning wreck dive and was rinsing gear with the rest of the group, 4 other divers and 2 crew aboard a budget live-aboard charter. Known for his methodical approach and detailed safety questions during briefings, Michael had researched affordable Caribbean diving options extensively. This was his first time diving outside the continental United States, and he approached it with characteristic enthusiasm and caution. Michael wasn't reckless. Most crew described him as extra careful, but that afternoon, the transition between routine and risk came gradually. The boat had chummed earlier to attract reef sharks for underwater photography, dropping bait into the water before the second dive. Caribbean reef sharks had responded quickly, providing excellent footage for the group. Afterward, the water was cleared, and the area seemed quiet as divers returned to the deck for lunch and equipment maintenance. The crew reminded Michael that earlier baiting might still be drawing attention and advised staying close to the boat. A younger deckhand mentioned that oceanic white tips had been sighted just 2 days earlier, only a few miles south. Michael nodded, replied he would only stay out a few minutes, and entered the water from the stern ladder. Michael swam slowly, keeping his fins near the surface with his head down, peering into the deep vertical void beneath him. From the deck, his pale back remained visible about 30 feet from the stern, adjusting his snorkel as he drifted calmly. The first person to spot the shark was another diver drying off near the railing, while moving farther from the hull's protective shadow. She saw it just under the surface, moving in a wide arc with dorsal and pectoral fins rigid and broad. Its path curved slowly, then narrowed with predatory focus. She called out frantically, but Michael didn't hear over the sound of his own breathing through the snorkel. He lifted his head only when the shark was already completing its second investigative pass. Oceanic white-tip sharks, averaging 8 to 10 feet and weighing up to 200 pounds, are bold, persistent hunters known for circling behavior and slow, confident movements. With broad pectoral fins and a white-tipped dorsal, they're unmistakable and infamous for investigating shipwrecks and floating prey. The oceanic white-tip struck without hesitation, rising from below and latching onto Michael's right thigh with devastating force. Its jaws opened laterally in the characteristic characteristic white-tip bite pattern. Deep, sawing pressure driven by rows of serrated teeth designed to tear through flesh and bone. Michael's scream echoed across the open water as he thrashed desperately, trying to turn, but his right leg collapsed inward. Blood clouded the water immediately, dense and maroon, sinking into the blue depths. He began swimming frantically toward the boat, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as shock set in. The oceanic white-tip's hunting strategy involves persistent attacks, wearing down prey through repeated strikes rather than a single killing blow. This behavioral pattern makes them particularly dangerous to humans in open water, as they rarely retreat after initial contact. Michael made it less than 10 feet before the shark returned with increased aggression. This time it struck from behind, its massive jaws closing around his lower back just above the hip line. The bite tore deeper, widening the wound and exposing vertebrae while severing critical muscle groups. The boat's deck erupted in shouting as one crew member grabbed a rescue line while another jumped in with a flotation ring. By the time they reached him, Michael's arms had stopped moving. His body floated face down, trailing a crimson streak that spread across the surface like spilled paint. They hauled him aboard, his wetsuit shredded at the thigh, blood continuing to spill from the devastating lower back wound. He was unconscious, his lips already pale from massive blood loss. The crew began CPR while frantically calling in a mayday over the VHF radio. The nearest port was hours away, and Michael's injuries were catastrophic. Oceanic white-tips possess a bite force capable of crushing bone, and their serrated teeth create wounds that continue bleeding long after the initial attack. Michael was pronounced dead 35 minutes later from massive hemorrhage caused by femoral artery trauma. Bahamian authorities met the boat at the dock that evening, conducting brief interviews with the captain and recording witness statements. Based on behavior patterns and wound characteristics, investigators confirmed it was almost certainly an oceanic white-tip, drawn by residual scent and surface activity following the morning's chumming operation. There was no indication the shark had lingered after completing its attack. Michael's body was flown back to Michigan within 5 days. His funeral was held quietly in Jackson, attended by family, friends, and co-workers from the engineering firm where he had worked. The dive charter company made no public statement, but internally updated safety policies to restrict unsupervised swimming in open blue water. They added stronger language about baiting protocols in post-dive areas and revised liability waivers to include specific references to pelagic shark behavior. Long before Michael's blood had cleared in, off the edge of New York's continental shelf, a weekend spearfisher slipped into deeper water, unaware that something far larger was already closing the distance. It was September 10, 2018, and the Atlantic was restless off Montauk Point. The surface looked deceptively calm from a distance, but closer in, the water heaved in slow, uneven swells, leftover motion from a recent offshore storm. Just past the visible reef, 3 men stood aboard a small center console boat, anchored near a shelf drop-off about 3 miles offshore, where the water dropped steeply and turned a deep metallic blue. Alan Ruiz, a 45-year-old freight driver from Queens, adjusted his mask and slid into the sea. He was the kind of man who worked long shifts through the boroughs and escaped the city on weekends, finding solace in spearfishing, a working-class pursuit where old gear and intuition mattered more than modern dive computers. Known among friends for his steady hand with a pole spear and his eye for striped bass and tautog, Alan was competent, careful, and didn't take chances he couldn't explain. That weekend was different. His friends Marco and Tino had access to a borrowed boat and suggested trying an offshore drop known as South Ledge, a deeper site with strong bait currents and rumored schools of big blackfish. The water that morning was cool at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with visibility between 15 and 20 feet, enough to see shadows, not enough to make them out clearly. What Alan likely didn't fully appreciate was the apex predator that ruled these deeper waters. Great white sharks are the ocean's most formidable hunters, capable of growing over 20 feet long and weighing more than 5,000 pounds. Their massive triangular teeth, arranged in multiple rows, can exert bite forces exceeding 4,000 pounds per square inch, enough to bite through steel cable. These prehistoric predators can detect a single drop of blood from 3 miles away and sense the electrical impulses of a beating heart from hundreds of yards. When hunting, they often approach from below with explosive speed, breaching completely out of the water to strike prey at the surface. Anglers in the region had been discussing unusual shark sightings during late summer tuna runs farther offshore, with reports of great whites passing through canyon lines. But closer inshore, no one took the chatter seriously. Alan had heard the talk and joked on the way out that if they saw anything bigger than a thresher, he would throw his spear and swim back to Queens. Everyone laughed, assuming they would encounter nothing larger than a bluefish. Alan entered the water first, wearing a 3mm wetsuit and carrying his usual aluminum pole spear, simple, single-pronged, and suited for close-range work. He had been in for less than 10 minutes, scanning the edge of the shelf, when he surfaced suddenly with urgent movements that initially looked like his usual fish-spotting signals. Then his voice carried across the water, flat and urgent, calling out about something big as he began swimming towards the boat. Tino stood up and scanned the surface, spotting the shadow first, wide, slow, gliding just feet below the waterline. Then the dorsal fin breached, thick and blunted. He yelled a warning, but Alan had already turned to see the massive predator bearing down on him. The great white struck with devastating precision, attacking from below with the explosive force. There was no dramatic splash, just a burst of foam and sudden downward pull as Alan's body jolted and disappeared beneath the surface. The attack was fast and silent, over in seconds. When Alan resurfaced, he floated on his back, mask gone, spear still attached to a loop on his wrist. His left side was torn open from rib to waist, the wound exposing bone and lung tissue. His left arm was missing below the shoulder, bitten clean through by the shark's massive jaws. Blood poured from the open cavity, darkening the water in a fast-growing radius. His eyes were open but unfocused, and he made no sound. Marco jumped in with a rope and swam to him, pulling his body back to the boat by the harness strap. They hoisted him over the side, but there was no pulse. The wound had severed major arteries. CPR was attempted for several minutes, but the blood loss was too extensive. Alan was declared dead before they reached the marina. The body was brought ashore at Montauk Harbor, where an autopsy confirmed exsanguination from a large shark bite. NOAA scientists measured the wounds and estimated a great white between 12 and 14 feet. The single bite and lack of follow-up suggested typical investigative behavior, not a sustained attack. Alan's remains were transported back to Queens, where his wake was held in the basement of a Catholic church near Jamaica Avenue. Family, co-workers, and friends from the spearfishing community attended, most in jeans or work boots, some holding laminated photos of Alan with his catches. In the days following the incident, the local authorities issued a public advisory, urging caution for divers and spearfishers near drop-offs and bait-rich waters. They emphasized that while attacks remained rare, warming seas and shifting prey patterns were bringing large predators closer to shore more frequently. Thanks for watching. If today's tragedies piqued your interest, the next video features more deadly animals. See you there.